All right, welcome everyone to our Google Hangout on PNgrowth, an innovative program for Indian startups and entrepreneurs centered around a 3-day boot camp from January 8th to 10th in Mysore. I'm Aaron Chatterji, professor at Duke University, one of the organizers of the conference. We have an all-star panel here today. I want to introduce them one by one, and then we're going to open up a discussion. And about 20 minutes in, we're going to open up for your Q&A. So I hope you'll be participating interactively there at your desks. So Samir Palnitkar, president of ShopSocially, is with us. Beerud Sheth, co-founder and CEO of TeamChat, two first-rate entrepreneurs who are going to talk about what they've learned from the entrepreneurial experiences they've had and how it relates to what we're trying to do in PNgrowth. Both Samir and Beerud are also involved in iSPIRT, which is obviously the engine behind PNgrowth. Speaking of iSPIRT, we're also joined by Sharad Sharma, the co-founder of iSPIRT, serial entrepreneur, and a personal force of nature, I think, when it comes to the Indian startup scene. Good to have Sharad here. Also, Rem Koning, who is a researcher from Stanford University, part of the organizing team. We're glad to have him with us today. Welcome, guys. I'm really excited about it.
Thank you.
Good stuff. So I feel a little bit of sentimentality about the upcoming trip to India for me. It's been a few years since I've been back to Bangalore. As might be sort of discerned by my surname, my parents came from India to the United States in the 1960s. Back then, it was the search for economic opportunity that brought them here, and I think they find it quite ironic that I'm going back to explore all the economic opportunities in India that are coming out of the Indian startup scene. So that's been a pretty cool experience. I'm looking forward to going back. And we've had a lot of interest in this boot camp. And so when you look at it for PNgrowth, nearly half the spots are already filled. We're getting applications by the day from the best and brightest companies in India. So we encourage you guys to apply now. It's very likely we're going to fill up before the deadline, and we really hope that the best product entrepreneurs in India are going to be able to join us. Let me talk a little bit about what we're trying to do at PNgrowth, because it's not like other entrepreneurial conferences. It's not a conference at all. It's a boot camp, and I want to tell you what we're going to do. We want to build category winners. We're not really interested if you don't want to be a category winner, then there's another event for you. But we really want category winners coming out of India. And here's how we're going to do it. Our mantra for this boot camp is 3 R's: Rethink, Redesign, and Reignite. So let me talk about each of those and why they're important, and then we'll open it up to the panel. So first, Rethink. Every time I talk to startups in the US, in India, around the world, they're all relentlessly focused on execution. Execution is really important for startups. It's a really good thing. But when is the time to really stop and think about where you are, where you want to be, and how you're going to get there? That's what rethinking is all about. And we're going to start that process at PNgrowth in January. Refactoring is about how you shape your company to move in that direction. Once you chart a strategy, how do you adapt your organization to get there? How do you change the strategy? How do you change human capital? How do you think about financing and technology and how they all fit together? The refactoring process is something we're going to be focusing on at PNgrowth in the bootcamp as well. And finally, Reignite. Reignite is the outcome we're hoping for out of PNgrowth. That's how you become a category winner. We want to help you develop your company into the strongest possible leader it can be. We want to leverage the best research and practical advice from entrepreneurs from across the world. So today, I want to focus on one part of that refactoring sort of process, and that is strategy. And as we talked about before, we talked a little bit about this before the call, sometimes a lot of entrepreneurs don't feel like they really need strategy. So Samir, I want to start with you, because you have a lot of experience in entrepreneurship. You've thought a lot about strategy, and you've done a lot of executing as well. And you've also talked a lot about execution at the roundtables that iSPIRT does. Talk a little bit about how you think about strategy and why entrepreneurs need to think about this along with execution, and how it's kind of oriented itself in your career as well.
Sure. Strategy is very, very important. I mean, if you look at any company, there are really 3 distinct areas that they need to think about. I mean, you have to think about it top down, not bottoms up. So the first, at the very top level, is an objective. To give you an example, I want to grow the revenue of the company 3 times in the next 2 years. That's an objective. Then at the next level, you think, say, hey, what are the strategies I need to do or to employ to achieve that? And you could say something like, we can achieve this revenue growth by, let's say, improving our closing rate from 20% to 30%. That could be a strategy. And then a tactic or the execution is, how do I now improve the closing rate? Do I need to improve my PPT? Do I need to improve my graphics? Do I need to add a feature in the product? That becomes tactic. The mistake that a lot of entrepreneurs make is as soon as they receive funding, they frantically do a bunch of stuff without really knowing where they're going. And unless they're taking that top-down approach, you will end up making a lot of activity happen, but really not getting in the direction you want to go. And that's the reason why, though the urge to actually do a lot of stuff is there, it is important that especially the founders focus a lot on the strategy piece.
And Beerud, I want to ask you to jump into this too. I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs tell me, look, strategy, I'll think about that later. They hear what Samir is saying, but they say, look, the mistakes I'll make, I'll figure it out later. I'll pivot. I can come up with a strategy later on. How damaging could it be for an entrepreneur who doesn't follow Samir's advice, who doesn't think about strategy, Beerud, early on? What kinds of mistakes can happen? Why should we be thinking about this now?
Yeah, I think let me explain this with an analogy, right? So when you're driving a car, strategy is like steering, while execution is like the accelerator. Imagine if you're driving a car with just the accelerator, you're going super fast in whichever direction you're going, and I mean, that would be ridiculous. You need to change course. In fact, before you even get in the car, you need a map. Which way are you going? Maybe the road you're going down, there's a dead end out there. Maybe it needs to turn around. Maybe you need to work around, and so on. So if you're not steering your car, I mean, it's a surefire recipe for a disaster, for an accident. And it's something that you absolutely need to do. You need to keep calibrating. Every once in a while, you need to stop. Maybe the road's closed ahead. Maybe there's a landslide. Maybe the circumstances have changed, and you need to stop. You need to rethink, redesign your map. Which way you're headed, and then kind of go ahead. So it's not just the accelerator. In fact, sometimes you need the brake. You need to slow down. You need to steer your way around challenges and get ahead. So to me, it's kind of, I mean, if you don't think about strategy, I mean, you're just guaranteed to have an accident.
That's awesome. And I think about all the accelerators like Y Combinator and Techstars. Maybe we should start building a steering group rather than an accelerator group, right? To help people do a little bit of both. At least until we invent self-driving strategies, right? So like the self-driving cars that Google is coming up with. But I think that's still a long way off. Sharad, what about you? You've seen this from the iSPIRT community and, of course, your extensive entrepreneurial experience. How do you weigh in? When was the time in your companies that you started to think about strategy? And what do you see from a lot of the younger entrepreneurs in the Indian ecosystem? When are they starting to think about strategy, and should they be doing it earlier?
Yeah, so I think, in some sense, people have become much more thoughtful about getting to the product market fit than what used to be the case a couple of years ago. Now, I think the real challenge in the ecosystem is, many people are getting reasonable growth as a result of being, finding this fit to the market, but very few of them are emerging as category winners. And winning a category is not an accident. It has to be part of a thoughtful process, and it needs a game plan. It needs a strategy. And in some sense, this PNgrowth is a place where you can focus on that. And in the midst of all this humdrum of daily stuff that is happening, a founder never really gets a chance to step back and think about what will it take to develop a game plan for winning a category. And so it gets deferred. It gets deferred to much later than it should. And by the time people start looking at that, it is too late. Somebody else in the market has stepped up and taken that category leadership role. And we've seen this happen again and again. Very promising companies didn't step up at the right time and therefore missed that opportunity to emerge as category winner. So really, in some sense, the way I see it is the focus of PNgrowth is getting people to make a call much earlier in their life cycle. Pallav has this description that we've been using. They should start focusing about winning the category when they are going from 1 to 10 and not from 10 to 100. Because if you're only going to focus on it when you start get to that 10 to 100 zone, it's too late. Too much of debt has accumulated inside the company in terms of culture, team, process, and it becomes very hard to change things to aspire for that leadership position. So this is really, from my perspective, what category leadership or category winning is about.
Shard, I think that's great. So, I mean, Rem, this sounds like when you're starting a road trip, you need to decide what lane you're going to drive in before you start pushing the accelerator down, right? My wife always says I don't look at the directions beforehand. I spend too much time just driving fast in the left lane. Maybe if we plotted out, right, the strategy first, we could actually get somewhere by going fast. Rem, I mean, a lot of this seems to be a response to the emphasis on execution from things like the lean startup. You know, methodologies like that have revolutionized what we do at business schools like Duke and Stanford. You've been around Silicon Valley for a long time. What do you see as a balance between strategy and execution? And maybe is it time to go back to sort of the thinking and the kind of reflecting part of entrepreneurship before just focusing only on acceleration? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think so. So if you actually look at Stanford GSB, you can take tons of classes in sort of lean model startup, and they have this class startup garage that you can join, and it's all about sort of, you know, how quickly can you execute, can you get to some sort of product market fit. But I would say probably the most popular class in terms of the entrepreneurship curriculum at the GSB is a class taught by Professor William Barnett and then a VC and entrepreneur, Andy Radcliffe. And that class is very much about stepping back and thinking about how you build a strategy to grow your company. And I think Andy has a really good point, which is that if you're going to go on a road trip, make it a real road trip. Don't just go on a one-day jaunt, you know, around the corner. If you're going to be spending 3 years building your startup, make sure you get somewhere really exciting and you make that journey long. And so Andy's point is your goal is not to build a 10-person company, right? You're putting in hours, you're putting in weekends. You want to build a strategy so that you can build the next 100-person, 1,000-person company. So you can become that category winner, that sort of globally competitive force, right? When you're growing these startups, you don't want to sort of get stuck as an also-ran. And that's something that you often see because it gets comfortable. You get to that 1 to 10 stage, I think, that Pallav talks about, and it's easy to become complacent. It's easy to focus on doing the same things every day because those are the things that you're comfortable with, instead of sort of stepping back and saying, okay, how do I now sort of find, how do I look at my map and sort of reset the direction so I can become that sort of next great company? And that's what we're really interested in sort of helping startups do. It's something that's easy to lose sight of. I think something that, you know, if you're just looking at the blogs, reading sort of, you know, Hacker News, or, you know, you're on your story, it's easy to get lost in the daily execution details. And this is a place where we really imagine part of the reason we want to take everybody to Mysore as part of the boot camp is that it's going to sort of remove you from the daily hustle bustle, right? So you're going to have a chance to sort of really reflect and spend 3 days really focusing on how to think about how do I become that category winner? How do I design a strategy that gets me there?
Yeah, and that is the goal of PNgrowth. So for all those who are on the Hangout, who've already applied, who already are going to participate, we're hoping to take you away from the hustle bustle and give you a chance to think about where you want to go and how you're going to get there. Because we know, and the entrepreneurs on this Hangout know, that you don't have time when you're relentlessly executing. So let me go again to Samir and Beerud a little bit to talk about their own companies. So Samir, in some of your own companies, how did you think about strategy? Was it something you wrote down? Was it something you told your employees about? Was it something you chatted up about over chai? How do you think about strategy? How formal is it? And how often did it change in the companies that you've been successful in?
In the initial stages, I mean, again, while we are having this discussion on strategy, I mean, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of execution. But what I found is that the iteration between strategy and execution is really quick. I mean, sometimes it's you almost iterate every day. You're thinking of a strategy, executing on it. The next day you have another thought, and that's what happens. But and again, the other thing typically in an organization is the strategy is done by the thinker and the execution is done by the doer. In the initial stages, when you're a couple of guys, I mean, you're the thinker and the doer, and you're constantly iterating in your own mind, oftentimes in your sleep, through what could be the next game plan, what would we do, and stuff like that. So I think in the early stages, it is oftentimes those roles get mixed. But as the organization grows, as you have like 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, founders have to step more into the role of a thinker and really be pointing employees in a certain direction. And the way we used to point it is to kind of every day just get people together and chat about it, or if it's a low cubicle space, then everybody else hears and kind of gathers information from that. But that's how you typically get that done. But what I realized is as the team grows, it's very, very important that, as Beerud said, being the steering is more important than being the accelerator. Let the doers or the employees you hire for specialized jobs do the acceleration, and you do the steering.
Yeah. And Beerud, how did you do that in your companies? I mean, you start to hire when you get more and more people. Let's say you get past 15 people, you're hiring people who are specialists, people who might not have as much domain knowledge because they're doing something very specific in your company. How do you get them on board for strategy? I mean, how do you get everyone to put their hands on the wheel, or at least know where you're going? How did you do that in yours, Beerud?
I think whenever an entrepreneur comes up with a strategy, so in our case, I mean, it's really important that you simplify it and articulate it for the rest of the team, right? And oftentimes sometimes it's a very simple goal, right? You're going to get, I don't know, 100 or 1,000 customers of this kind, or it's a specific product direction. You know, we're going to go sort of build a beautiful messaging app, for example, in our case, a TeamChat and so on. So I think you identify, you kind of have to simplify, and it's very clear because you know, in a startup organization, you have very different roles. Everybody's playing versatile sort of roles, and they need to be able to sort of think back about, okay, what is the higher level objective we are driving towards. So we would literally sort of formalize it into, you know, the top 2 or 3 KRAs and common goals for the whole team, and then from there trickle down to individual goals and responsibilities. But I think the other key point to remember is, you know, strategies, it has to be a continuous thing, right? Like even in the road trip analogy I was saying, for the most part, your environment is fairly stable, right? The roads are the same, the highways are the same, and so on. But in tech universe, our environment is constantly changing, right? New roads come up, others disappear. New land, you know, mountains show up, and others sort of disappear. Competitors and so on and so forth. So it becomes even more critical to steer your way around. It's kind of like a video game, really, with constantly changing environment. And I think in that sense, you know, you have to keep a finger on the pulse. Are the assumptions that you built your last strategy on, are they still valid? Is something changing? Are the customers different? Are the competitors different? Is the tech paradigm itself, have we gone from, let's say, feature phones to smartphones? Suddenly, whatever strategy you came up with earlier, I mean, you kind of need to rethink and so on. So it's sort of, you know, even when you're saying in pure execution mode, you need to keep just at least validating, are your assumptions for the original strategy still in place, and if they're not, you kind of need to step back, think about it, and sort of iterate the process.
Yeah, I mean, and in terms of that iteration, I mean, Sharad, it sounds like the iSPIRT community and other ecosystems could be really useful sounding boards for checking those assumptions on your strategy that Beerud was talking about. Am I right about my assumptions about the market? Tell me where I'm wrong. And also kind of keeping your ears and eyes open for thinking about how you might adapt your strategy to changing conditions. Sharad, do you see those opportunities in the ecosystem in India? How are entrepreneurs sharing ideas about strategies, and have you seen that be beneficial for them in the iSPIRT community?
Absolutely. I mean, so that's happening in a good way now. And a good example of that is the SaaSX that happened on October 7th, where 140 founders got together, and it was not so much of a learning session, but just a networking session, so that those linkages build up, and that let people continue these conversations later on. And one of the themes that seems to be coming out from all of these gatherings is that just like we talked about driving, I'll use a different kind of an analogy here, and that is if you want to be into professional sports versus casually playing a game, then it's important then that your lifestyle is different when you're 12 years old, 10 years old, and if you don't think about your lifestyle differently at that early age, there is no way you will become a professional sports person at the age of 18. Right, and if you start thinking about it only when you turn 16 or 17, it's too late. There is nothing you can do about it by then, and unless you are exceptionally gifted and you're one in a million. And so really the goal of PNgrowth in some way is to encourage people to think about how to become a category winner well before it becomes visible to people that that's a conversation they should be having with themselves and with their team members. And if at all we can accomplish one thing, which is to get them to think about what their game plan should be and put it into effect a year or two earlier than what they would have normally done, I think we would dramatically improve the number of category winners that would come from the pool of people that are available in the ecosystem today. And ultimately, our success of the ecosystem is a function of how many category winners we create, because these are the winners that accumulate value inside themselves. And if you measure the success of the ecosystem, it will be described as a cumulative number of what the winners are bringing to the table. So that's really the ecosystem purpose behind doing PNgrowth as an exercise.
And that's just it, right? I think that's the cost of waiting to think about strategy tomorrow or the next day. You can't become a professional athlete if you decide when you're 18 that that's what you want to do. You have to start planning a long time before. And just like being a category winner, we want you to start as early as possible, right? Don't be like me. When I was 18, I wanted to be Leander Paes, Indian tennis player, and then my mom told me it was too late. So don't be like that. Start practicing early with your forehands and your backhands. Rem, I want to bring you in and also integrate some of the audience discussion, because we're getting some great questions. And if I encourage the folks on the Google Hangout to keep submitting them. So Sridhar has a question about this and says, look, an agile strategy is what works in a startup until you have paying customers, and you might be going back and forth, and isn't that just fine? So I want to expand on that a little bit by saying, would you ever want to switch strategies when you do have paying customers, or are customers kind of evidence that your strategy is working? What do you think about that, Rem?
That's an interesting point. I think you should treat your early customers as very much a signal, right? You're not looking for profit early on. What you're looking for is signal that your product is wanted and if there's sort of a potential for growth, right? And so I think with you're taking an agile strategy, you're seeing that your customers are hitting. Let's see, you're seeing that growth over the first year and the customers are coming on. That may be a great time to actually step back and think about your strategy and say, okay, we've got people who want to use our product. Let's understand why. Let's think about, I think, going back to that sort of top-down discussion we had earlier, let's think about what our objectives are, and then let's think about sort of what are the things we're going to need to do to get to those objectives. Because I think it's really easy when you're doing agile to sort of forget about sort of bigger plays and just sort of constantly repeat and loop and do what you're doing. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do agile. I think that's an incredibly important part of developing a good strategy, but it's always worth spending a little bit of time stepping back and saying, okay, I've got these customers coming in. What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? How do I double down on that good so I can continue sort of growing at an excellent pace?
Yeah, and I mean, and Sridhar has followed up here. I mean, I think, and he's adding some good points. Look, I think the other key point is we forget in strategy that we choose our customers. One of the biggest differences in entrepreneurship versus big company strategy, and this is what we're going to talk about at PNgrowth, part of the time, is you get to choose your customers. And every startup that I've been involved in eventually has this discussion, right, to say, hey, are these the right customers? Is this the lane that we want to be playing in? And sometimes that answer is no, and the strategy changes. So for Sridhar and for Aishwarya and other people who are asking about this, I think that paying customers are great, but what we hope at PNgrowth is that you're thinking about whether these are the right customers that are going to get you to category leadership. Because sometimes if you have the wrong customers, you end up answering questions, doing things for them that leads you down a lane that's actually not going to be a category leader and not going to be a winner at the end of the day. And I think that's somewhat of the risk here in thinking about this. Let me go back to Samir and Beerud again for some of the entrepreneurial perspective that they've seen in their companies. Samir, Beerud, how do you guys see kind of the elephants in the industry compared to the mice, the little startups? It seems like there's big companies and little companies competing, and strategy can be very different for big and small. Your big competitors, if you're going up against Google or Facebook, they have lots of money to spend. They can afford to have lost leaders in different sectors. Startups, sometimes it's the only product you have, and you got to go for a win in that particular area. So Samir, how have you thought about competing with large companies and small companies? And have you considered partnerships in some of the different areas as a strategy to try to mitigate competition or learn from your competitors?
Sure. So the only way, in fact, in today's world, the only way to win against a large company is to be extremely focused. That's the only way to win, because especially if you look at the way the SaaS world is evolving, it is more important to build a simple product that does one thing and one thing very, very well and sell the heck out of it. That has to be the way it is, and it has to be better than any company on the planet. If you try to build a lot of features into the product and try to be like the large companies, then that will actually not work. So that is one thing that I highly recommend for any startup. One of the questions that Aishwarya asked is, going back, the customer is asking us to do this, should we do it? And my answer would be, it is equally important to say no to customers, even if they're paying you a lot of money, simply because it may lead you down the wrong path, and that one customer may actually cost you your category leadership down the line.
Samir, that's awesome. I want to build on that with Beerud because Dropbox is a great example. There's a famous story about how Drew Houston, the founder of Dropbox, he had a list of suggestions that customers gave them, and one of the things way back when was to sync the Dropbox with the My Documents folder. And at the time, that was actually a really complicated thing to do that could ruin a lot of user experience. But users were convinced that they wanted it, and for a long time he didn't do it. And people said, "You're not being responsive to customers." But he was actually trying to take. He didn't want to take away from his strategy, which was simple and easy, right? Backup, storage, and sync, simple and easy. Syncing to the My Document folder that early would have ruined that. And he said no to the #1 requested thing from his customers. So Aishwarya, that's an answer, I think, both from Dropbox's history and also Samir's real-life experience that you have to think carefully. And that's exactly what we want you to do at PNgrowth. This is when you get to take time and think about these things. Beerud, did you want to jump in on this too in terms of listening to customers and whether we should have a customer-driven strategy versus something else?
Yeah, actually, just quickly before I come to that, I think you raised an important point. If you're a mice trying to compete, if you're a mouse trying to compete with an elephant, don't compete on the elephant's home turf. Find some new turf that's emerging and play in that space, right? So we talk a lot about category winning, but let's not presume that there are boxes of categories out there and there are empty boxes which you can go take, right? There are new categories emerging. In fact, new categories that no one has thought of that you can define for yourself and say, you know what, here's a new category. I'm going to create it first, and then I'm going to win it, right? I mean, ride-sharing, Uber wasn't a category that existed. Airbnb wasn't a category that existed. It used to be hotels, but you completely transform the category, and that kind of disrupts the whole thing, right? So I think I draw a lot of inspiration from Archimedes' famous quote, right? Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum to place it, and I can change the world. And I think the point is, whenever there's a paradigm shift, and if you use that as your fulcrum, then you're, it's fair game. You can compete with an elephant because guess what? They're not nimble. They can't. Well, if you're nimble, you're fast. It's new turf. It's unclaimed category. You can absolutely go in there and do it. And then when it comes to specifically listening to customers versus not listening, yeah, you got to be a little careful. Listen carefully. You don't have to do everything they say. You do what's consistent with your strategy, the way you've defined it. And if they help you move along, if they serve as lift, absolutely do it. And if it feels like drag, ultimately it's your gut call. But if it feels like they're pulling you in a different direction from where you want to go, you have to be conscious enough to not listen to that customer.
Yes. And Beerud, you bring up another set of good points, which is is again another sporting analogy. So I hope people like sports analogies in the Hangout. But if you're a football player, right, and this is football everywhere outside the U.S., so it's soccer in the U.S. If you're a football player, you got to go to where the ball is, right? Not just follow the crowd and run relentlessly down the field. And I think for a lot of strategies, trying to figure out where the ball is going to be and get there first, and that's what a mouse can do before an elephant, right? And that's a really key thing to think about for startups.
And in fact, if I just jump in with one more point, the challenge is in the VC ecosystem, there is an intensive focus on copycat formulae, right? Because people say, oh, if there's one Ola that got funded, well, let's have 10 more Olas. If one Flipkart got funded, let's do 10 more Flipkarts. When the counterintuitive thing that most entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs, don't realize is there's a huge premium for a category leader, which means the second Flipkart or the second Ola is not going to be nearly as valued as the first one. Right? So you're really better off, even though counterintuitive as it sounds, crazy as it sounds, you're better off creating a new category and being the new Ola of something else than sort of chasing in a copycat way. And they assuming that investors, because they love one company for one thing, they're going to love 20 other companies. I mean, that's kind of the stupidest thing to do. And therefore, identifying, in fact, creating new categories that you then go on to win is a very important part of this.
Awesome. And Sharad, I want to bring you in here for a second too. Give us some examples from your vast experience about some of the category winners in India right now, and maybe if you think that they've been really focused, because Sonal has a great question on the chat, which is saying, okay, I understand what these guys are saying. They know what they're doing. You got to focus. And we all agree with Samir on that. But what if I go to my customer and they say, well, you're not solving the entire problem? How did these category winners coming out of the Indian ecosystem mitigate that? The relentless focus that Samir's talking about, not trying to be all things to all people, but being able to sell into these customers that are looking perhaps for a comprehensive solution. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So let me talk about people who should have been category winners.
Oh, very good.
Did not turn out to be one, right? I mean, clearly Air Deccan opened up a whole new category, but Indigo is the winner. You know, had they thought about, you know, the kind of company and kind of culture, the kind of team they want to build, they would have been Indigo Airlines today. Even in the mobile world, Reliance actually created the category of low-cost mobile, but Airtel emerged as a winner, right? And so we can see again and again that people who initiate a category may not actually emerge as winners in all situations unless they are able to figure out what are the things that they need to do differently to step up to be a category winner. Because essentially, I think Beerud made a very good point that it is a mouse versus elephant game. And category winners come about when they beat an incumbent system, let us say. Airbnb and Uber are beating a system that exists, an incumbent system. It's not a particular competitor, but a system that they're competing with. In India, you see that happening with Team Indus, which is saying the incumbent system is that only government space agencies can send something to space. As a private entity, I want to be able to do that. Now, it's a tough system to beat. And if you got to take on something as big as that, you need a very thoughtful approach to be able to get there. Or take companies that are beating an incumbent company. You know, my favorite example is InMobi taking on Google and Facebook. Now, clearly, these are ferocious competitors to fight against. And just a product market fit is not sufficient to actually be able to disrupt those incumbents, and you need something more to make that happen. And that something more, that game plan, is really the focus of PNgrowth here. And if you don't worry about it early enough, you know, you may have this initial glow of success that Air Deccan had or Reliance Mobile had, and yet not get to the pole position that you deserve probably to be at. And that's really what I think we'll be focusing on at PNgrowth.
Great. I mean, and Rem, I want to come to you for a second here because you have a lot of experience from the psychological and sociological research perspective. The story of Reliance is an interesting one because they did Bharti Airtel that won that category to exactly what Samir talked about. They focused very relentlessly on the consumer-facing side of the telecom business and outsourced a lot of other parts of the value chain, right, allowing them to be successful and beat Reliance and others. How hard is it for entrepreneurs to focus psychologically from a network perspective when they're talking to other entrepreneurs?
I mean,
why is it so difficult, and how do they overcome that? And how can we help them at PNgrowth get to that?
Sort of the founder of a company, you're being pulled in every direction every minute, right? You've got your Slack chat open, and you've got employees pinging you. What do I do next? I have this problem. You've got your board. You've got your outside network of mentors. You've got other founders who you're talking to. So it's increasingly easy to become very distracted by sort of the world around you and let the environment pull you. Right? And instead of you choosing your customers, you're sort of letting the tugs of what you experience in the world force you in all these different directions. And so, I mean, there's psychological reasons. We can look at cognitive biases. I mean, I think the sort of network's perspective is incredibly valuable here, which is just you have a lot of people asking for your time, and that becomes increasingly hard as your company starts to scale. So to return to Sharad's point, if you don't set up this strategy early on, you're going to have an increasingly hard time to do it later because you're going to constantly have demands on your time. It's going to be harder for you to go to a 3-day retreat like our boot camp and spend that time sort of reflecting on how you want to redesign your strategy. When you have 100 people all asking you what you need to do all of the time. So if you can set this up earlier, right, it makes it much easier to deal with those demands that can be, help you essentially set up so that your interactions are focused and not sort of all over the place.
Right. And like, again, to this question on the chat or this comment, I think that, very few categories, I mean, as Beerud was saying and Samir was saying, are going to be empty. They're not going to be total white space. But you have to go into a category where you have the right tools to win, right? They often say a military analogy, and we've been doing a lot of analogies, is, right, you want to pick a battle that your army can win. And I think choosing a category, right, whether it's crowded or not, right, whether is all about where you can compete and win, but that's strategy, thinking about that ahead of time. But because of the demands on your time that Rem was talking about, because of all the execution focus and entrepreneurship that you need to do that Samir was talking about, it's very difficult to sit back and make those decisions and think about it clearly and test those assumptions with your peers and mentors. That's exactly what we're going to try to do with PNgrowth, and so we hope that we'll delve deeper into these topics then. We have about 10 minutes left. We'll continue to take questions from the chat, but I also want to open it up again to our entrepreneurs to sort of talk about this in a little bit of more detail from their experience. So Samir, was there a time when you had to make a radically a shift in your strategy based on what you had set out, and how difficult was that? How did you sort of steer the ship in a totally new direction? How did you communicate that with employees, and how did you know that you were right? How did you know that the new strategy was right and the old strategy needed to be jettisoned? Talk about an experience like that.
Sure. So in fact, that happened with my recent company. We started off as a cross between Quora and Pinterest. So we were actually a B2C company. And we did that for a while. What we realized, trying to put these two things together doesn't really work. However, we had built a lot of technologies and a lot of tools around it. What we realized is we could really help businesses make their websites a lot more socially engaged using some of these tools that we have developed. And that was a fundamental shift in strategy, or a so-called pivot in the company's history. And this is something we had to consciously make because we had to reorient our thinking, we had to reorient our employees, we had to convince them that one way was better than the other. And clearly, as we started seeing the initial customer traction, and that helped us kind of reinforce and consolidate that strategy and convince the employees that we were going in the right direction.
Yeah, rethink, redesign, reignite. But as Samir talked about, it's not as easy as that, because you have employees who are vested in a particular strategy. The person who was dealing, for example, with the customer channel, as you described it before, now that needs to shift if you're going to focus on a B2B solution. And that person's going to feel A, that they failed, and B, that they haven't been given enough time, and C, they're going to be skeptical. How do you retain that kind of person and change strategies? And Samir gave us an example of that. Beerud, how about you? How are you thinking about strategy pivots? Have you done those in your career? Any sort of experiences or lessons learned that you'll share with the group that's going to come to PNgrowth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've done, any entrepreneur that's been around a long time will have to go through multiple pivots, and it's a exercise in sort of intellectual humility. Seriously, right? I think we are often in a business where you may not know that your new strategy is correct, but you're more certain that your current strategy is just wrong. Right? You're headed into a dead end. It's not working. Whatever you've been doing, it hasn't been working, and you can't continue that expecting different results, right? It could be the market has changed, the environment has changed, the paradigm, right? You go from feature phones to smartphones, something changes, and then you can't continue with the status quo, right? So you're more certain that the current strategy is wrong. As far as the new one's concerned, yeah, you need to go back to the drawing board, redesign your strategy, and then figure out where to go. And making that shift and taking a team along is really, really hard. And I think the only answer I can suggest is, you have to do it with complete honesty. If you try to be defensive, if you try to hide the fact that we were wrong, nobody will believe you, right? So you kind of have to say, okay, here were the assumptions why the old strategy, why we went down the old path. Something's changed, or here are the things that have changed, which is why it doesn't make sense to continue down that path. Here's where we believe the world is going towards, and here's what we are going to do to get there. And frankly, look, anybody who's in the startup business has to know, including your employees, saying, look, this is part of the course. These kind of things happen all the time. You can't get fazed by it. You have to deal with it with maturity and sort of recharge and move along. But if you're all together along this new path, I think we are more likely to succeed. So it's not easy to have these conversations, but at least if you're honest, people can judge for themselves. And usually, startup employees, they self-select smart people who are willing to take chances, willing to take risks, and they also kind of reach the same conclusions, based on the same assumptions and the same observations. So I think you just have to carry everyone along. That's ultimately the entrepreneur's sort of job, the burden, that he has to bring everyone along. And once you do that, I think people just move on. And we've had many such pivots in our sort of company life, and we've been able to navigate them. In fact, in many ways, strange as it may seem, the team relationships end up being a lot stronger, because whenever you go through typically when you go through a traumatic experience, but everybody sticks together and believes in a new thing, they fight even harder to win the next time around.
Yeah, so Rem, I want to quickly jump to you on that, because Beerud says so many interesting things there, but one of the most interesting for me was this notion of honesty and authentic leadership. And that's something that we don't always talk about, but we are going to talk about it at PNgrowth. And this is another part of the program having to do with authentic leadership. Talk a little bit about what we're planning there and how it relates to that honesty. I mean, that really, Beerud is bearing his heart there, saying you have to tell your employees, I messed up. I went this way and it didn't work, and now we're going to move this way, and you have to have confidence in me, even though I may have been wrong the first time, even though we may have all been wrong. How do you do that in an authentic way? How are we going to work with people to develop those skills?
I think it's a really hard thing. It's one of the things that separates being a founder from being, a PM at Google, is that your sort of identity and who you are is wrapped up with the company, right? Your authentic self is very much part of the company that you're driving. So not only are we going to focus on sort of building out strategy for the company, but we want to focus on sort of how do you sort of integrate yourself with that company and feel comfortable being honest with your employees, sharing stories about how you feel. I mean, I think one of the things that one of our people on our team, Solen, was doing a bunch of interviews in Bangalore with startups, and one of the things that she found was that a lot of founders felt really lonely, right? They feel very depressed. They feel like they don't have someone to talk to. So I think, on the sort of first day of the program, one of the things that we really want to incorporate is sort of integrating, I guess, the emotional side of being a founder. How does it feel? How do you share that with other people? I think that's something that's often very hard to do in your company. Often you have to put on a face, and sort of learning how to sort of reveal your authentic self to both motivate your employees and sort of drive forward is a difficult thing to do. So we're going to have a series of exercises based off actually what some classes and courses taught at Stanford GSB. They're going to sort of help you open up and explore that sort of, I think, emotional side that often gets lost in these discussions, but are probably equally as important as developing a strategy or coding out your product.
Fantastic. And Sharad, I want to ask you about this too. I mean, this notion of sharing is really, really difficult, right? Our identities are wrapped up in our companies, and it's very hard to share those things with your peers, with your mentors, with your family. You've done a lot of great work with iSPIRT in getting people to share best practices, getting to share what works and what doesn't. We're going to leverage all that when we do PNgrowth. What's some of the things you found work really well in these settings? What's the best way to get people to share in these things and have a productive exchange?
Yeah, so you got to have a big, hairy objective, right? And that, of course, will change over a course of time. But unless you're able to, have a big goal, you cannot subordinate the egos. You can't get everybody to subordinate their egos to that goal. So in iSPIRT's case, the big, hairy goal is India should become a product nation. Now, that's not an easy thing, but that's a great way for everybody to subordinate their egos. Even people with big egos know this is something bigger than them. And so that forces everybody to come together, to line up behind that goal. So I've been involved with Stayzilla, for example. I just tell that story from a company perspective. Company started in 2006. It took till 2008 for them to find some kind of a product market fit. Then in 2010, the entrepreneur figured out that, okay, I am going to go for broke, right? I'm going to be the biggest hotel room provider in India. And indeed, by 2014, in November of 2014, he overtakes Make My Trip, the largest hotel room provider, and emerges as the largest player in the country without spending any money on advertising. No money on advertising at all. People started seeing their ads only after they became the #1 player. And now, he took this company. I'm a lead investor there, so I'm happy to, tell you the story from the inside, and completely reframe what the objective of the company will be, because the old objective no longer applied, and suddenly created a burning platform for everybody to come together to reinvent the company all over again. Now, this is extraordinarily hard to do if you are coming on the back of a successful execution in the last few years. People just don't want to change the way they do things because that old system was working. That's why they became the market leader, right? And suddenly you are saying you got to reinvent yourself all over again, right? And that ability to reframe what this company is going to be about is very hard. And it has to come from the founder, because that person is most vested and most credible inside the company to be able to reframe issues even when the going is good. You know, anybody can do it when the going is bad. Very few people can do it when the going is good. And I'm hoping, you know, out of the 200 people that we have, we'll have a large number of them who are there because the going is good, but they actually want to go for broke and really redefine their category and emerge as category winners.
And Sharad, if Sharad is describing you out there on the Hangout or people who are watching this, please register for PNgrowth in Mysore, January 8th through 10th. The spots are filling up very quickly. All half the seats already, and maybe more since we've done the Hangout, are already taken. We're looking for the best product entrepreneurs in India who want to rethink, redesign, and reignite their companies and be category winners. This is the way India is going to become a product nation. I want to thank Sharad. I want to thank Samir. I want to thank Rem and Beerud. You guys were awesome. I wish we could do this for another hour. If you want to see more of these guys, we'll all be at PNgrowth. Thanks, everyone in the audience and the iSPIRT team that's made this chat possible. We'll see you next time, and hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Okay.